So what are some procedural differences towards the end of session between the California State Senate and the California State Assembly? I want to take a look at just a few differences in four common legislative floor operations between the end of the session versus earlier in the session. The first is concerning concurrences. Under Assembly Rule 77, a vote to concur in any Senate amendments to an Assembly bill must meet the same vote threshold required for the bill itself to pass. This is generally a simple majority vote unless otherwise specified, such as with an urgency clause. However, the concurrence vote cannot be taken until the bill has been on the unfinished business file for one calendar day, and this is known as the one-day waiting period. Note that this does not apply to the last 2 days of the legislative session. Assembly Rule 77 can and does get suspended, which we find sometimes at the end of session in the crunch of business. On the other hand, the California Senate does not have a one-day waiting period. Senate Rule 29 still requires that an amended measure being returned to the Senate from the Assembly with amendments to appear on the unfinished business file of the Senate daily file. And senators have to be provided with an analysis of that amended Senate bill. But there's no requirement in the Senate's rules for a one-day wait on the daily file. The next concerns floor amendments, and the two houses of the California legislature operate slightly differently in how they amend the other house's bills on the floor. In the Assembly, legislators are required to submit amendments the night before the Friday deadline, that is Thursday at 5 p.m. Although at the end of session, the desk is known to stay open later to process potentially a crush of amendments that might be coming in. And then the next day on Friday, generally, the floor manager, who is the Assembly member who's managing or presenting the Senate bill on the Assembly floor, has to stand up on the Assembly floor and present the proposed amendments and seek approval for those amendments, which is generally done by unanimous consent or by roll call vote if there's an objection to granting unanimous consent. Any member can request a roll call vote, and in that case, of course, the bill is amended by a majority of those present and voting. In the other house, in the state Senate, amendments are not presented on their floor. Instead, amended bills are placed on the second reading file, and amendments are processed by the Senate desk. So that effectively means that Assembly bills, as long as they're amended through 5 p.m. or when the desk shuts down on that deadline week, those amendments can be made. The next procedural item, slight difference between the two, is Assembly batching versus Senate special consent calendar. And in recent years, the term batching has come up more increasingly on the Assembly floor, but not always. And basically, batching is a process where the Assembly uses unanimous consent on the floor to permit a single vote for multiple bills or the adoption of amendments. It's used occasionally when both the Democratic and Republican caucuses both have a support recommendation and no Republican legislator has abstained or voted no on the bill in committee. Now, this is similar to what the Senate calls its special consent calendar as opposed to its regular consent calendar. The other item is this belief about going past midnight and what has to occur. Now, this question arises at the end of session in the first year as the clock clicks or ticks closer and closer to midnight on the scheduled adjournment date. For example, in the 2023 legislative session, it's scheduled for September the 14th. And the question always arises, can legislative business be conducted after midnight on that last day of session? In an even numbered year, the election year, of course, the question is clearly answered by the California Constitution because Article 4, Section 10C states clearly that the legislature must conduct and complete its work by midnight, August 31st, except for 5 possible bills that are exceptions to that midnight mandate. However, in the first year of the legislative session, that is the odd numbered year, the date of adjournment is set by the joint rules of the Senate and the Assembly in a concurrent resolution. Now, in some years, following its practice and its custom and practice, the Senate will work past the midnight deadline without suspending that joint rule. The Assembly, however, generally passes a resolution suspending the joint rule. Now, that raises the question whether the Assembly has to suspend the joint rule and whether the Senate should be suspending the joint rule. My personal belief is that there's no reason to suspend the joint rule. Most importantly is because as a general principle of our separation of powers doctrine in this state, the judicial branch is not going to consider a legal challenge to a statute that is alleged to have violated a simple internal rule of procedure of the houses of the California legislature. So it's unlikely that a lawsuit would be filed, and even less likely that a California court would accept such a challenge.